The brigantine cut through moonlit water like a blade through silk, her black sails catching wind that carried the scent of gunpowder and coming storm. Aboard the Venganza Roja, 43 men moved in practiced silence, their eyes fixed on the Spanish galleon anchored 3 cables' length ahead, lanterns glowing warm against the darkness of Cartagena's harbour. Captain Bartholomew Crowe stood at the helm, one hand resting on the pommel of his cutlass, the other gripping the worn wheel. They called him the Red Captain, not for the colour of his coat, though crimson it was, but for what he left in his wake. Burning ships, bloodied decks, and the screaming silence of plundered ports along the Spanish Main. It was August of 1716, and his name was whispered in fear from Havana to Portobelo, from the Windward Passage to the colonial drawing rooms of Kingston, where merchants paid protection rather than face his guns. If you're captivated by tales of the sea and the golden age of piracy, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The raid on Cartagena had been planned for 6 weeks. Ever since, word reached Nassau that the treasure fleet would assemble there before the autumn crossing. Crowe had sailed these waters for 14 years, first as quartermaster aboard William Kidd's adventure galley, then as captain of his own vessel after the mutiny off Madagascar that left Kidd in chains and Crowe with a stolen frigate and a loyal crew. The Venganza Roja was smaller than what he'd commanded before, but she was fast, well armed with 18 guns, and crewed by men who knew that fortune favoured the ruthless. Tonight they would take the galleon Santa Teresa, laden with Peruvian silver and emeralds from the New Granada mines, anchored foolishly close to the outer harbour, where the Spanish believed their fortress guns offered protection. But fortress guns could not depress low enough to strike a vessel hugging the shoreline, and the harbour watch had grown lazy in their presumed security. Thomas Garrett stood beside Crowe, his weather-beaten face barely visible in the darkness. The first mate had sailed with the Red Captain since the beginning, sharing the blood of 20 successful raids and the gold that filled their hidden coffers on Tortuga. "The tide turns in 2 hours," Garrett murmured, his voice carrying the burr of his Devon origins. "If we strike now, we can be out past the reef before dawn." Crowe nodded once, his eyes never leaving the galleon. Around them, the crew readied grappling hooks and boarding pikes, checked the priming on their flintlocks, ran wet stones along cutlass edges until the steel sang softly in the night. Below deck, the gunners stood ready, slow matches glowing like demon eyes in the darkness, waiting for the order to run out the cannon and unleash hell upon Spanish oak. The attack came swift and terrible. The Venganza Roja ghosted alongside the Santa Teresa before the watch could raise alarm, grapples flying through humid air to bite into Spanish rail. Crowe led the boarding himself, cutlass flashing in lantern light as he cut down the first officer who stumbled from the companionway. His men poured across like a crimson tide, overwhelming the skeleton crew left aboard, while the galleon's officers dined ashore. Pistol shots cracked in the tropical night, brief and sharp, followed by screams and the clash of steel. Within 10 minutes, the Santa Teresa was theirs, her holds groaning with chests of silver reals, sacks of raw emeralds, bolts of Chinese silk carried across the Pacific from Acapulco. The fortress guns finally spoke, their thunder rolling across the water, but the shots fell short, splashing harmlessly as Crowe's men cut the anchor cables and let wind fill the captured galleon's sails. By the time dawn painted the eastern sky with blood and gold, 2 ships sailed north toward the Cayman Islands, and Cartagena's governor stood on the ramparts, watching his king's treasure disappear beyond the horizon. They reached their hidden anchorage 3 days later, a nameless cove on the southern coast of Grand Cayman, where mangrove roots tangled in clear water and land crabs scuttled across white sand. The division of spoils began immediately. conducted according to the articles every man had signed before sailing. 2 shares for the captain, 1.5 for the officers, 1 for each able seaman, half shares for boys and those who manned the pumps. The treasure was magnificent. 40,000 pieces of 8, 73 pounds of uncut emeralds, silks and indigo, and casks of Peruvian wine. It was the richest prize Crow had taken in 5 years. Enough to make every man aboard wealthy by sailor standards, enough to retire to Charleston or Port Royal and live as gentlemen if they chose. But sailors rarely chose such wisdom. The celebration lasted 2 nights. They roasted wild pigs over driftwood fires, passed bottles of captured wine until dawn, sang bawdy songs that echoed across the still water. Crow sat apart from his men, as captains did, watching from the quarterdeck of the Venganza Roja while they revelled on the beach. Garrett joined him as the fires burned low, bringing a bottle of the Peruvian red. "The men are pleased," the first mate said, settling against the rail. "Best haul since we took the Dutch merchantman off Curaçao." Crow accepted the bottle, drank deep, felt the wine warm his throat. "They should be. Each man's share will keep him in rum for a year." Garrett was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "Some are talking about settling," he said carefully. "Taking their shares and disappearing into the backcountry, or finding passage to the colonies, where no one asks questions if your gold is good." Crow turned to look at him, his eyes hard in the firelight. "We sail in 3 days," he said flatly, "for Nassau. Morgan is assembling a fleet for a raid on Portobelo, and he's offering letters of marque to any captain willing to sail under his flag." Garrett nodded slowly, but something unspoken hung between them, heavy as the humid night air. The whispers began the next morning. Crow heard them in the pauses between conversations, saw them in the glances men traded when they thought he wasn't watching. William Hart, the boatswain, a scarred giant from Liverpool who'd survived the hurricane of 1712, stood with a group of the older hands near the water's edge, their voices low but urgent. Young Peter Carlyle, barely 20, sat cleaning his pistol with unusual care, his face troubled. Even among the officers, the atmosphere had shifted. The sailing master, a Frenchman named Bellamy, spent more time than necessary checking the Santa Teresa's rigging, avoiding the quarterdeck where Crow held court. Only Garrett remained steadfast, moving among the crew with quiet authority. But even he seemed troubled by currents Crow couldn't quite fathom. It was the surgeon who finally spoke plainly. Dr. Ambrose Fletcher had sailed with Crow for 7 years, a former Royal Navy sawbones who'd deserted after a flogging he deemed unjust. He came to the captain's cabin on the 3rd afternoon, when the sun beat down like hammered brass, and the crew dozed in whatever shade they could find. Crow was studying charts, planning the passage to Nassau, when Fletcher entered without knocking. "You need to know what's brewing below," the doctor said without preamble, his educated accent at odds with his sun-darkened skin and missing finger. "There's talk of dividing the ships. Half want to sail with you to Nassau and Morgan's venture. The other half want to take their shares and the Santa Teresa, head south to Brazil or the River Plate, where Spanish authority is thin and land is cheap." Crow looked up slowly from his charts. "Mutiny," he said, the word falling like a stone into still water. Fletcher shook his head. "Division. They're not talking about harming you, Bartholomew. They just want to go their separate ways while the gold still shines." That evening, Crow called a council of the ship's officers aboard the Venganza Roja. Garrett, Bellamy, Fletcher, Hart the boatswain, and young Carlyle, who'd proven himself in the Cartagena action. They gathered in the captain's cabin as sunset painted the western sky in shades of fire, their faces grave in the lamplight. Crow poured rum for each man, then stood with his back to the stern windows, the fading light silhouetting his tall frame. "I understand there's dissension," he began, his voice carrying the authority of 14 years at sea and 100 successful raids. "Some men want to take their shares and leave. That's their right, according to the articles we signed. But we sail as one crew or not at all. The Santa Teresa stays with me. Any man who wants to leave can take his share and find passage aboard some other vessel." Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the creak of timber and the distant cry of gulls. Hart spoke first, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Captain, with respect, the Santa Teresa represents more than just another prize. She's worth £10,000 herself, maybe more. The men who fought for her feel they've earned the right to decide her fate." Bellamy, the French sailing master, leaned forward, his dark eyes catching lamplight. "The articles say the crew votes on major decisions, Captain. Whether to attack, where to sail, how to divide extraordinary prizes. The Santa Teresa qualifies as extraordinary." Crow's jaw tightened. He'd lived by those articles for years, the rough democracy that governed pirate vessels and separated them from the rigid hierarchies of naval ships. But he'd also held crews together through storm and battle, kept men loyal when easier paths beckoned, built a reputation that opened ports and intimidated enemies. "We vote then," he said finally. "Tomorrow morning, crew assembly on the beach. Those who want to stay with me and sail for Nassau under letters of marque, those who want to take their shares and find their own way. But the Santa Teresa stays mine. That's not negotiable." Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "Bartholomew," he said quietly, "that's not how articles work. If the majority votes to keep the galleon and sail south, they have that right." The Red Captain's hand moved to his cutlass hilt. "Let them try," he said, his voice cold as deep water. "I've held this crew together for 14 years. I've made them rich beyond what any merchant captain could offer. They follow me because I've never led them wrong. Tomorrow, they'll remember that." But the dawn brought revelation of a different kind. Crow woke to the sound of shouting, tumbled from his hammock to find the Santa Teresa gone. She'd slipped her mooring in the darkest hours before sunrise, sailed out of the cove under minimal canvas, so quietly that even the watch had missed her departure. 23 men had gone with her, more than half the crew, led by Hart, the boatswain, and including young Carlyle and 3 of the gunners. They'd taken their shares of the silver and emeralds, loaded them aboard the galleon along with weapons, powder and provisions, and vanished into the Caribbean dawn. Crow stood on the beach, staring at the empty anchorage, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Beside him, Garrett was silent, his weathered features unreadable in the early light. "How did I not see this?" Crow said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. "How did they move an entire galleon without our knowing?" Fletcher, who'd remained loyal, spoke from behind them. "They had help, someone on our watch, someone who wanted them to succeed." The investigation was swift and brutal. Within 2 hours they'd identified the traitor, a young sailor named James Rookwood, barely 18, who'd stood night watch and deliberately failed to raise alarm when the Santa Teresa's crew began moving. Under Garrett's questioning, he broke quickly, admitted that Hart had promised him a full share rather than the half share his youth warranted if he helped them escape. Crow wanted to hang him from the yardarm, but the remaining crew voted for marooning instead. 3 days on a deserted quay with a pistol, powder, and shot enough to end his suffering when starvation became too great. It was a mercy Crow didn't feel inclined to grant, but he honored the vote. They left Rookwood on a barren rock north of Grand Cayman, his cries of protest fading as they sailed away. The Venganza Roja sailed for Nassau with 20 crew, barely enough to man the guns and work the ship, and Crow's authority hung by threads thinner than spiderweb. Those who remained were loyal: Garrett, Fletcher, Bellamy, and men who'd followed the Red Captain through hurricanes and naval blockades. But the loss of half his crew and the Santa Teresa burned in Crow's chest like swallowed coals. Worse was the knowledge that his reputation would suffer. Word of the division would spread through every pirate haven, from Tortuga to Barbados, and other captains would smell weakness the way sharks smell blood in water. In the dangerous brotherhood of freebooters, a captain who couldn't hold his crew was a captain marked for replacement, or worse. They reached Nassau in late September, when the hurricane season pressed heavy on the Caribbean, and most sensible sailors stayed in port. The pirate republic sprawled along the shore, a chaotic collection of taverns, brothels, merchant stalls, and beached vessels in various states of repair. Henry Morgan's flagship, the Satisfaction, rode at anchor in the harbour, her 36 guns a statement of power that no other captain could match. Crowe went ashore immediately, seeking audience with the man who'd once sacked Panama and now offered letters of marque from the governor of Jamaica, transforming pirates into privateers with legal sanction to raid Spanish holdings. Morgan received him in a tavern overlooking the waterfront. The legendary corsair, now in his 60s, his face seamed by sun and battle, his reputation still formidable despite age, and the gout that plagued his legs. "I heard about the Santa Teresa," Morgan said without preamble, his Welsh accent still strong after 40 years in Caribbean waters. "Lost half your crew to mutiny. That's a hard thing for any captain." Crowe bristled at the word mutiny. "Division," he corrected. "They left by right of articles, not force." Morgan's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Call it what you will, lad. The result's the same. You're here with an undermanned ship and a damaged reputation, looking for employment." He poured rum into 2 pewter cups. "I need captains for the Portobelo raid, it's true. The Spanish have fortified the place since I last took it, and they're holding $500,000 in treasure, waiting for the treasure fleet assembly. But I need captains I can trust. Men who'll hold formation when the cannon starts speaking, who won't find their crews deserting at the critical moment." The words cut deeper than any cutlass, but Crowe held his anger in check. "My crew didn't desert in battle," he said evenly. "They left during division of spoils, which is their right. Those who remain are blooded veterans who've fought beside me for years. Give me a place in your fleet and I'll prove the Red Captain's worth." Morgan studied him over the rim of his cup, his shrewd eyes missing nothing. "You're proud, Bartholomew Crowe. Pride's kept many a good captain alive, but it's killed more than it's saved. What happened aboard your vessel is happening across the Caribbean. Men are getting older, tired of the life, wanting to settle before age or cannon takes them. The golden days are ending. Spain's navy is stronger, England's governors are less tolerant of our activities, and the treasure's not as easy as it once was. Letters of marque are the only way forward. Legal sanction to raid enemy shipping while protecting ourselves from the noose." He refilled both cups. "I'll give you a place in my fleet. 4th position, supporting the assault on the seaward fort. Prove yourself at Portobelo, and maybe we can discuss command of something larger. But understand this, I'll not tolerate dissension or division when Spanish guns are firing. Your crew stays together, or you find other employment." The raid on Portobelo was planned for November, after the hurricane season ended, but before the treasure fleet departed for Spain. Crowe spent the intervening weeks recruiting, offering generous shares to experienced sailors willing to sail under a captain whose reputation had been tarnished. It was harder than he'd expected. The story of the Santa Teresa had spread, embellished in the telling, until men spoke of wholesale mutiny and violence aboard the Venganza Roja. Some sailors avoided him entirely, seeking berths on other vessels. Others demanded reassurances he couldn't give, wanting promises of easy prizes and safe harbors he had no authority to grant. In the end, he assembled a crew of 32, enough to sail and fight the brigantine, but barely, and half were green hands who'd never faced naval cannon or Spanish infantry. Garrett worked them hard, drilling gun crews and teaching boarding tactics, while Bellamy ran the new men through sail handling until they moved with something approaching competence. But the easy camaraderie that once characterized the Venganza Roja was gone. replaced by wariness and calculation. Morgan's fleet assembled in early November, 8 ships carrying nearly 600 men, the largest pirate gathering since the sack of Maracaibo 7 years earlier. The plan was straightforward: sail into Portobello's harbour under cover of darkness, overwhelm the seaward fort with concentrated cannon fire, then land assault parties to take the town while it was confused and disorganized. The Spanish commander, Don Francisco de Córdoba, had strengthened the fortifications after Morgan's previous raid, adding guns and increasing the garrison to 300 regular infantry. But the pirates had surprise, experience, and desperation driving them forward. Crow studied the assault plan in Morgan's cabin the night before they sailed, memorizing his position in the formation, the timing of the bombardment, the landing beaches assigned to his crew. 4th position meant he'd follow the leading vessels into the harbour, add his 18 guns to the barrage against the fort, then disembark his men to support the main assault on the town's defences. It was an honourable position, neither leading nor trailing, and Crow accepted it with the knowledge that success here could restore what the Santa Teresa incident had damaged. The fleet sailed at sunset on November 3rd, 1716, catching the land breeze that carried them north from Nassau toward the Spanish Main. Crow stood at the helm of the Venganza Roja, feeling the brigantine respond to his touch, watching his crew move through the rigging with growing confidence. Perhaps they could still succeed. Perhaps Portobello would prove the Red Captain wasn't finished. That one division didn't mean the end of a distinguished career. Beside him, Garrett seemed to sense his thoughts. "We'll do well tomorrow," the first mate said quietly. "The men are ready. They've trained hard, and they trust your judgment." Crow nodded but said nothing. Trust was a fragile thing at sea, built over years and destroyed in moments. He'd trusted his crew aboard the Santa Teresa, and they'd vanished in the night. The attack on Portobello began 2 hours before dawn on November 5th. Morgan's flagship led them into the harbour, her guns running out as they approached the outer fort. The Spanish watch saw them too late, raised the alarm too slowly, and within minutes the Caribbean night erupted into thunder and fire. 34 pirate guns spoke as one, hurling iron at stone walls, dismounting Spanish cannon, killing gunners before they could respond. The Venganza Roja held her position perfectly, Crow bellowing orders through the smoke and noise, while his gun crews worked like demons, swabbing and loading and firing until the brigantine's timbers shook with each discharge. The seaward fort's return fire was sporadic and poorly aimed, most shots screaming overhead or splashing harmlessly into the harbour. Within 40 minutes, the fort's guns had fallen silent, its walls cracked and burning, its garrison either dead or fled into the town. Morgan's signal rockets arced into the sky, red and green stars that commanded the landing to commence. Crow led 30 men ashore on the merchant's beach, their boats grating on sand as cannon smoke drifted across the water like fog. The town was in chaos, Spanish infantry firing from windows and rooftops, civilians fleeing toward the interior, bells clanging alarm from the cathedral tower. Crow's men formed a rough line and advanced toward the customs house, firing and reloading, responding to orders shouted through the pandemonium. Young Timothy Walsh, a green hand from Bristol, went down with a musket ball through his shoulder, crying for the surgeon. Michael Braddock, an experienced hand, took a sword thrust, defending the captain's left flank, his blood bright in the dawn light. But they kept moving forward, taking buildings one by one, pushing the Spanish back toward the central plaza where Morgan's main force was gathering for the assault on the governor's residence. Crow fought with the cold fury of a man who had everything to prove, his cutlass rising and falling, his pistol barking in the smoke-filled streets. This was what he'd been born for, this violence and chaos and terrible clarity of purpose. Here there were no questions of loyalty or articles or divided crews. Here there was only survival and victory. The battle raged through the morning. Spanish resistance was fiercer than expected, Don Francisco rallying his garrison for a desperate defense of the town center. Twice Morgan's men were driven back from the plaza, leaving their dead in the street. Twice they reformed and attacked again, their determination fueled by knowledge of the treasure waiting in the customs house and governor's strongroom. Crow's crew acquitted themselves well, showing courage under fire that impressed even the veteran pirates around them. By noon, the issue was decided, the Spanish flag hauled down and Morgan's banner raised over the town. Don Francisco surrendered with dignity, yielding his sword to Morgan while Portobelo burned around them. The customs house held 50,000 pieces of 8, the governor's residence another 20,000, and merchant warehouses contained indigo, tobacco, cacao, and other goods worth twice that amount. It was a magnificent success, and Morgan personally commended Crow for his conduct during the assault. "You led well today," the old corsair said, gripping Crow's shoulder with a hand missing 2 fingers. "The Red Captain still got the steel for this work." But triumph turned to ashes 3 days later. The fleet had anchored outside Portobelo to divide spoils and make repairs when a sail appeared on the horizon. A small sloop flying Spanish colors. She was pursued by something larger, something familiar, and as it drew closer, Crow felt ice form in his chest. It was the Santa Teresa, her captured Spanish galleon now flying black flags, her guns run out and ready. Hart the boatswain stood at her helm, visible even at distance, and young Carlyle commanded the forward battery. They'd come not to attack, but to claim their share of Portobello's treasure, arguing that they'd sailed from Nassau as part of Morgan's original assembly, that their subsequent departure from Crow's command didn't invalidate their right to participate in the raid's division. It was a bold move, audacious, and technically legal under pirate articles, and it sent shock through the assembled fleet. Men who'd thought the Santa Teresa incident closed now saw it reopened, publicly, in front of the most powerful pirate captain in the Caribbean. Morgan summoned both Crow and Hart to the satisfaction for judgment. The council was held on deck under a canvas awning, with representatives from every ship in the fleet watching. Morgan sat in his high-backed chair like a king hearing disputes, flanked by his senior captains. Hart stood confident and unrepentant, arguing his case with surprising eloquence. "We left Captain Crow's command legally," he said, his Liverpool accent carrying across the deck. "We took our shares from the Cartagena prize and sailed away according to articles. We then joined Captain Morgan's fleet independently, sailing from Grand Cayman to Nassau and participating in the planning council before the raid. We didn't fight at Portobelo, true, but neither did the Marianne or the Fortune, yet they're claiming shares. Why should we be treated differently?" It was a strong argument, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled pirates. Morgan looked at Crow. "What say you, Red Captain?" Crow stood rigid, his face like carved stone. Everything he'd feared was happening. Public diminishment, loss of authority, the revelation that his crew had divided, and he'd been unable to prevent it. But he'd learned 14 years ago that showing weakness at sea was fatal. "They left my command in the night," he said, his voice carrying clear and cold, "taking not just their shares, but a prize vessel that belonged to the entire crew under articles. They betrayed their oaths and their captain. If you give them shares now, you tell every sailor in the Caribbean that desertion pays, that captains have no authority, that crews can divide whenever fancy strikes them. The articles exist to create order from chaos, but they only work if men honor their commitments. Hart and his followers should be flogged and their shares forfeit." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Morgan looked from one man to the other, his aged face thoughtful. Finally he spoke. "The problem," he said slowly, "is that you're both right. Hart's men left legally according to articles. They took their shares and departed peacefully. But Crow's right that rewarding them now sets dangerous precedent. If we allow this, every crew in the Caribbean will fracture into competing factions." He paused, letting his words settle. Here's my judgment. Hart and his men get no shares from Portobelo. They participated in planning but not action, and that disqualifies them. But Captain Crow, you must accept that your command of the Venganza Roja is compromised. The men who left took their legal rights with them. You cannot pursue them or demand restitution. Let this matter end here, now, with no further vengeance or reprisal. Both of you sail from these waters and don't cross paths again. It was a Solomon's judgment that satisfied no one. Hart protested, but was shouted down by the assembly. Crow stood silent, knowing that public vindication meant nothing when half the Caribbean knew his crew had divided. Morgan dismissed the council, and the fleet began preparations to depart, each captain returning to his vessel with the Portobelo shares distributed according to participation. The Santa Teresa sailed east toward the Windward Passage, Hart presumably intending to try his luck in less crowded waters. The Venganza Roja remained in company with Morgan's fleet, sailing back to Nassau through calm November seas. But something had broken that couldn't be repaired. Crow spent his nights in the captain's cabin drinking the Portobello wine and staring at charts that meant nothing. His shares from the raid were substantial, nearly 3,000 pieces of 8. But gold couldn't restore reputation or authority. Garrett tried to reach him, suggesting they recruit fresh crew and attempt to rebuild, but Crow barely responded. Fletcher the surgeon noted the captain's deteriorating state, but could prescribe nothing that would heal wounds of the spirit. They reached Nassau in late November to find the pirate haven transformed. The new governor of Jamaica, tired of the freebooters who operated from New Providence Island, had dispatched a naval squadron to clean out the nest. 2 frigates rode at anchor in the harbor, their 40-gun broadsides making clear that resistance would be crushed. Captain Jonathan Barnett commanded the operation, carrying royal pardons for any pirate willing to surrender and swear off the Brotherhood. Those who refused would be hunted down and hanged. Morgan himself had already accepted pardon, trading his letters of marque and reputation for legitimate retirement on a Jamaican plantation. The Golden Age was ending, not with battle, but with bureaucracy and pardons. Crow listened to the news with something approaching relief. Perhaps this was the escape he needed, the excuse to walk away from a life that had turned sour. His shares from Cartagena and Portobelo totaled nearly 8,000 pieces of 8, enough to buy land in Carolina or Virginia and live quietly under an assumed name. He could disappear into the colonies, become someone other than the Red Captain, let the reputation fade like morning mist. Garrett and Fletcher both planned to accept pardons, and they urged him to do the same. But Crow couldn't accept the idea of surrender, of walking into a British office and begging mercy from men who'd spent years trying to catch him. He made a different choice. On a December morning, when fog lay thick across Nassau's harbor, he took a single boat loaded with provisions and his personal share of treasure, and rowed away from the Venganza Roja while his crew still slept. Garrett found the note he'd left pinned to the captain's cabin door, written in Crow's angular script on the back of a Spanish chart. "The ship is yours now. Treat her well, and remember that pride is the only treasure that can't be stolen or divided. May you find better fortune than I did." BC. The Venganza Roja sailed that afternoon under Garrett's command, her new captain accepting pardon and legitimate employment as a merchant skipper. The brigantine's black sails were painted white, her guns removed, her pirate past officially erased. She would trade between Jamaica and Charleston for another 7 years before foundering in the hurricane of 1723. Bartholomew Crow was never seen again in civilized waters. Rumors placed him in the Mosquito Coast, living among the indigenous peoples and occasionally raiding Spanish settlements in a stolen canoe. Other stories claimed he'd sailed south to the River Plate and established himself as a trader in Buenos Aires under a Portuguese name. A few insisted he'd gone to Madagascar and joined the pirate communes on that distant island, becoming one of the anonymous brotherhood who preyed on East India Company shipping. The truth was simpler and more final. Crow sailed west from Nassau in his single boat, heading toward the Bahamas' outer islands where law and civilization thinned to nothing. He carried enough provisions for 2 weeks, enough gold for a lifetime, and a soul weary of command and betrayal. Somewhere among those sun-bleached cays and turquoise shallows, he vanished into legend. Perhaps a storm took him, the Caribbean claiming what Spanish cannon and British justice never could. Perhaps he reached some nameless island and built a life so quiet it left no trace. Perhaps he simply stopped fighting and let the sea do what the sea always does: erase the works of men. Years later, fishermen working the banks north of Andros claimed to find a wrecked boat on a deserted island, half buried in sand and wind-scoured beyond recognition. Inside, they discovered a cutlass with a handle wrapped in crimson cord, a compass of fine Spanish make, and a small chest containing exactly 8,000 pieces of 8, arranged in neat stacks, as if their owner had counted them one final time. The crimson cord identified the sword as belonging to Bartholomew Crow, the Red Captain whose name had once terrified the Spanish Main. But no body was found, no bones or grave marker, nothing to confirm how or when he died. The fishermen divided the coins according to ancient maritime custom and left the cutlass and compass where they found them, unwilling to disturb what might be a sailor's final rest. When they returned a year later, the island was empty, the boat and sword claimed by tide and time, leaving only sun-bleached sand and the eternal sound of waves breaking against coral. The sea keeps its secrets, and some men become those secrets, their endings known only to the wind and water that witnessed their final days. In the taverns of Port Royal and Tortuga, in the merchant houses of Charleston and Havana, old sailors still told stories about the Red Captain who once robbed ports and hunted ships until his own crew proved more dangerous than any enemy. They spoke of Cartagena burning and the Santa Teresa sailing away in darkness, of Portobelo's treasures and Morgan's judgment, of a proud man who couldn't accept that even pirate democracy demanded compromise. Some told the tales as warnings about the price of arrogance. Others framed them as tragedies about loyalty's fragility in an age without honor. But all agreed on one thing: that Bartholomew Crow had vanished into the Caribbean's vastness, leaving behind only questions and a reputation that survived his disappearance. His fate became another mystery in an era full of mysteries. Another captain who sailed beyond the horizon and never returned. The Venganza Roja changed hands and names, her history erased by respectability. The Santa Teresa was captured by a Spanish frigate off Hispaniola in 1718. Her pirate crew hanged in Santo Domingo without ever revealing what happened after they left the Red Captain's command. Hart, the boatswain, died on the gallows without speaking Crow's name. The golden age of piracy faded into memory, and then into myth, its violence and freedom replaced by order and law and the slow creep of civilization across waters that once belonged to no nation and no king. But somewhere in the Bahamas' outer islands, on an unnamed cay, where sand meets sea and only seabirds witness the passage of seasons, a cutlass with crimson cord remained for a time, as testament to the man who once commanded respect and fear, but lost the one thing no captain can afford to lose: the loyalty of those who sailed beside him.